for these slides. The link for these slides is here now in the chat window, and I want to focus on the winning aspects of libraries addressing the future, of libraries playing a role in the future, and of the role of the future in libraries. Now, of course, what's interesting for libraries is the continuum, the balance, the aspect of what's old and what's new fitting together to form new alliances, new directions. And one reason that this was pointed out to me really recently is that I just started actually receiving print subscriptions to newspapers. Now, I also read a variety of newspapers online, on my iPad, etc., but it's been nice and experiential to engage a print copy. Now, of course, they're not all as surprisingly and fun as the Financial Times weekend as we see from this picture. Now, really what occurs to me as we're developing and designing futures for libraries is that the past always has its value, but part of its value is as emotional point, as novelty, as connector. And so using that connector as a bit of an emotional novelty, and then using that emotion then to further the conversation going forward. And the reason I bring this up is because the library's future depends upon people's perceptions of value of the library now, of course. And the value is always attached to the traditional priorities that the library has continued to provide. And as we shift those priorities, as we add new ones, as we take some away, we are always, of course, balancing the reward of change versus the risk. And I actually propose that the biggest risk we face isn't missing opportunities, but missing branding and stories and connection to stories. Libraries have an ongoing and very important role in our vast communities that all relies on a traditional, a timeless message, a timeless story that we shouldn't be too quick to throw away, as we are being very quick and should be in addressing new technology opportunities. I actually just started a new position as Director of Library Futures for Innovative Interfaces. And I've been a librarian for about 7 years. 5 of those were as an academic librarian at Yale University, and the last 2 were as a consultant, where I was really focusing hard on helping libraries synthesize and address technology changes, trying to figure out what they meant for people's information consumption service expectations, and looking at what futures may look like. I actually get to do a very similar thing in my new role within the vendor side, but my most important thing that I do in this role is actually to advocate for the role and values of libraries within the vendor side. I don't actually do sales, I don't do marketing, I simply look for ways to empower the library community at large with the large company behind me. And the ways I do this are finding librarians that I can enable who are creating inspiration points. Those inspiration points which are furthering and benefiting the library of the future concept. I'm also making sure that librarians have a role in the conversation for a robust community future. Finding librarians that are doing extremely interesting things and making sure that they're getting the attention that they deserve for that, so that the value of the library in the future continues to be a conversation point across our communities. And I make sure that I'm here to help all librarians that are dreaming big. That's a story that I want to be a part of, and that's what I really get to do nowadays. I found this interesting yard bomb graffiti in LA a couple months ago, and it absolutely struck a chord. The most important thing that we're doing as librarians looking to the future is making sure that we're keeping the story of that passion for libraries alive, and that we're able to expand that within new technological realms. So the most important message out of our conversation should absolutely be that losing that passion is a fatal mistake. Now, I talked earlier about nostalgic values, and I think that the reason that we should be considering the past is that we have, or at least are attached to, the single greatest and most powerful brand in the history of humankind, and that is books and the stories that they empower. And that's not something that we should toss away too easily. I know that we want to challenge the brand of libraries as the future changes, as it focuses more on technology and less on print, but we really can't afford to give up the huge power that comes with transformative stories that libraries have been a part of. And there's especially interesting leverage there when we look at the print side of it. Now, of course, in practical terms, it really just means a strategic balancing of formats within our library that is time-sensitive and locally relevant. But we really need to make sure that the story we're telling continues to be part of the story points that have inspired people from libraries as they grow up and as they contribute to future aspects of society. Now, there was something that really impressed me and inspired me recently when I visited the California Science Center in the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles, where they host the NASA shuttle, and where they bring in kids to look at it and see the video and get inspired. These children's reaction is absolutely amazing. And they share some of the reactions in these little post-it notes they put on the board. These children who get to see the power of space exploration, and we directly get to see their inspiration and the application of this to their lives and their stories. And this reminds me that we should continue to be creating moonshots, but that those should also continue to be around our core strengths, not just new ideas, but traditional trajectories that then inspire side stories. As we move forward from our traditional core strengths, it'll be really interesting to see what awesome industries or projects or products pop up around us within the library community. And so we see that with more and more technological change and deeper impact of those changes in society, we have to then measure the landscape as one not only in flux, but as dynamic and as defined by change. So now, though, if we're looking at an ecosystem, a community, a landscape, an economy that is in constant change, and change is the new normal, then what is the role of the librarian? The very first and most important point is flexibility and the opportunity to help our communities be adaptable and successful with those ongoing changes. So adaptability is the key competency for librarians, and the ability to help our communities be able to further and succeed within that changing landscape. Now, I'm a big fan of libraries, of course, but I have to admit I have as much trouble with them as your average person. I know they say that just like the doctor can be the worst patient, the librarian can be the worst patron, and I do get frustrated pretty easily with the library experience, considering what I weigh it against in gaining access to content by technological means, etc. But it's really what's most frustrating is the seemingly random and varied mission that libraries are putting forth. And when I have a need that the library can possibly fulfill, it doesn't always do it in the easiest way. And I know, of course, what the practicality and the considerations are as a librarian trying to have awesome service. But I want to make sure that when I go to libraries, it's not just this plethora of possibilities, but maybe a few simple core strengths. And librarians have the skills to provide access to that. And so, streamlining the message down to what libraries are about now and what they're about next. And of course, one of those things that we've seen over the last couple of years is the library as creation point. The library being able to facilitate creators, to be a creator itself, and to curate locally produced creations. Now, of course, some of the bigger ways that we've seen this expressed have been in makerspaces, but it's also really big in digital media labs, in sound production labs, in the lending of media creation tools, etc. In a library I recently visited at the University of Nevada, Reno, I found that this sound recording studio was really interesting because what they were doing with it was allowing their patrons to create the sound relevant to their studies, etc., and do it in a very professional manner, having the skills and then gaining the experience. So what the library is doing is facilitating the experience of production and the experience of learning for an actionable outcome. And I think that's the role that libraries are moving more and more into, facilitator of creation and curation. And of course, makerspaces focusing on three-dimensional printing have been big this year, but that's just really a lifting off point. Now, the reason that three-dimensional printing is big in libraries is because it allows libraries to maintain a relevance and special focus on their physical spaces while being able to use the traditional roles of connector and facilitator. Now, in the beginning, of course, libraries were about facilitating access to knowledge, more recently about access to collaborative space, and then the creation of knowledge and the creation of research together. And so now it's just a slight shift over to creation of physical objects, etc., with three-dimensional printing. But that's just the current realization of this. What's next is going to be the facilitation of the creation of whatever may be locally relevant, what might be personally important, etc. And one way that I think that we're going to continue that role of facilitation and enabling and empowering is thinking about the library as an enabler of local entrepreneurs. Academic libraries that look upon their students as startups, and the model is really similar. You have a project that you invest in, you see it to fruition, and you allow it to reap the benefits of its goals. You help them gain the skills that they need to be successful students and also to be successful in the outside larger world. Now, of course, libraries themselves can be seen as startups, and specific staff within librarians act as entrepreneurs. But what's really interesting, though, is to identify exact ways that staff, that leaders, that librarians individually and as communities can really start to use the most flexible aspects of entrepreneurship while also having it within a strategic leadership model. And another area that I've been really inspired by and seen powerful opportunities for libraries would be the idea of the smart city, the application of big data and modern technology to running urban landscapes in efficient manners that allow people to really be enabled and empowered within their city community. There's been really interesting global examples of this, but the reason I think it's important is because they have a very similar mission to libraries, and that would be as an innovation hub for allowing for the success of a direct local community. Using technology as the tool, but it's not just about the technology as the goal. And so what I really want to see is all of us librarians who have really creative, innovative ideas being able to see those to completion, which can often be difficult within our communities, and being able to do it in a community setting. Now, I want to make sure that each and every librarian in the world has an opportunity to be their most creative, to do the most bold projects, to pursue the most grandiose dreams, to make sure that their goals can facilitate the continued expansion and growth of the library community in general. And so I want you to keep in mind and keep in touch with me about what ideas you're working on that are pushing the industry forward, that are making your library more and more future ready, and see if there's opportunities for us to make that project larger, or to just simply have it be a collaborative point at which we can all continue to grow together. And when we look at the barriers for that within our own libraries, it's most often institutional or cultural. And we can really conceive of these barriers, of these subsystems, as jumping off points. It's tensions which are growth opportunities, and being able to use those to expand will be our growth opportunity. And so it's really important that we conceive of the connections between us, between you and I, between us and our patrons, between us and the outside role which we're continually advocating towards, as having connection points around inspirational ideas that we share the goals for, or that we can work together with. That's the conversation that we're having with the larger world that continues to show our relevance. I was recently in a restaurant, I forget where, when the waitress asked me what I did, why I was in town. I told her I was a librarian. She smiled and said, "I'm glad that someone still believes in libraries." So even if the library is perceived as not necessarily being perfectly relevant in modern society, or if it's really interesting innovations to keep up with technology are not being as well marketed, or just our patrons are not aware of them, the value of the library and the belief around that continues to be an inspiration point. Now, there's a really interesting story going on with the watch industry, and it's fun to look for examples, for inspiration points, for analogies and lessons. And there's been really interesting to see how libraries kind of compare to what's been going on to wristwatches. And there's a lot of questions around how watches are able to pivot, to be able to still be relevant. And some of the questions that are being asked would be that, are they useless because that technology has moved forward? Because nowadays, hardly anyone uses their watch to tell time. We use our smartphone screens to determine the time. But also, some watch producers have found new life and success by simply looking for new or niche clientele, those people who still want to wear a watch for fashion reasons, etc. But then again, there's a whole other part that's using it for new opportunities, creating smartwatches that interact with wearable technology, that interface with our smartphones, etc., to do more than show the time, but to display and be able to engage higher levels of data. And one other consideration is whether it's okay to just serve the traditional community, even if it's minor, as long as it's a loyal market. And I think a confluence of each of these questions is what we should be thinking about when moving forward, that there's opportunities for new and old niches, but really the important thing is how to figure out that what was the core value as we move forward that will continue to be interesting to new communities. So what librarians really do, of course, is solve those tension points that our patrons are encountering within the world of information. And as the world of information continues to get more complex, as the information economy really settles in, and that becomes the growing point for all types of communities, then the need and the value of the library continues to expand as well. And so we should be considering what are the wider pain points that we could be providing solutions for, being reflective, looking at the tension points within our industry, the solution for which will mean leaping forward, or more importantly, the talking points around that we can have as a community. And so not only is change the defining landscape, but really I would say it's less and less turmoil and more change as stability. The waves are getting a little bit less rocky, and we're getting more used to the idea of an up and down landscape. Now, the reason I say this is because there are no major disruptions happening right now or predicted within the next year. It's really just an expansion of what's been big for the last couple of years. So even though we're at an era of unprecedented change, we're also at an era of slowing down the pace of acceleration for change. So right now, there aren't going to be any huge tensions caused by new technologies. It's going to be becoming familiar with more screens, with screens on more parts of our body, with a smartphone doing more. So it's going to just actually be an opportunity for us to take advantage of this slight period of stability before we see the next major changes for which libraries not only have to keep up, but can play an interesting role across our communities by helping our users be really efficient in keeping up and making sure that they're successful within that landscape. And the idea that we're looking at new ideas, new landscapes, new perspectives as creative opportunity points that we should be rooted in, but not rooted down by. The ideas should be latching us to the sky so that we're continuing to look as big as possible. When these new technologies emerge, we shouldn't be thinking of them as barrier points that we have to adapt to, but opportunity and expansion points that we can root ourselves to. And the best way to do that is to focus on a shared emotional experience. This picture is a bit dark. What this is a pub sign that instead of showing the name for the restaurant, it simply used a quote that it knew anyone would not only recognize, but really identify with. And so with this public relations wing, what they did is they focused on a shared cultural experience. And in general for libraries, that's access to information, but it's also attention over the shifting information landscape, the solution to which then libraries are continuing to be the center. And so we're looking at where we're going to be next, but the best way to do that is to look at where we are now. Let's take a brief look at the technological landscape, what's going on in content technology, what's going on in messaging technology, so that we can get a really good idea of what the opportunities for growth are. Big things going on now would be everything from content-related interaction points, from automatic content recognition to the new points of information input and output, and for information transfer, and for using the world around us for information gathering. Visual displays have been really big on tabletops for a while, and they're also expanding in more than just display methods on our walls, but they're deepening to the interactive element of visual displays is becoming much more and more personalized and localized. And then near-field communication, NFC, represents a really wide trend of being able to get access to information or interact with others around information based on your proximity to that. So the reason that NFC is a good example of this is that what it does is use something like RFID over very tiny distances to transfer small files, like payment in the subway or contact information. QR codes do a very similar thing, except QR codes use your camera aperture. So up till now, QR codes have been much more well known because the camera for a smartphone is near universal, where NFC chips have not really expanded into Apple, et cetera, so they're not quite on the mass market. But the idea of having a locally relevant access to information is going to continue to be big, whether it is NFC or augmented reality, et cetera. And then, of course, there's the idea of ambient engagement with location. So Foursquare really took off the idea of being able to interact with physically, locally relevant info associated with a specific location or place, but maybe you have to engage with the place before you could engage with the information. Then Google Now, a product that has been around for a little while and continues to expand, is Google's answer to locally relevant information displays. So if you have a Google Now app and your account set up, if you're walking through something that it knows that you tend to like, if you're walking past a museum and you visited a lot of them, or if you're walking past something that has something to do with something on your Google Calendar, it'll give you an alert or prompt with a link to more information, either from a Wikipedia page or a Google page. The idea of being able to preempt based on your behavior and your location. And as we look at this attempt to reinforce the action points for libraries back to that information experience, we see that what we've done really well will continue to be important. That is facilitating success through the question. And that question, not just the answer, but the pursuit of information through the question, is going to continue to be a major capital for all types of libraries. Now, of course, there's always interesting things to watch going forward, but as I said, nothing majorly different. In Gartner's recent Strategic Technology Trends prediction for 2014, we see that a lot of what's being predicted, we're already getting a hint of, and it's just going to become bigger. The idea of smart machines where things are being able to interact more with each other, not just our smartphones and our computers, etc. And as we look at these, we figure these are all very easy opportunities for libraries to play a role in managing data, in facilitating the connection of data with experience, in providing opportunities for information professionals to organize or provide access to data, etc. And of course, when we look at the plethora of changes and the predictions for technology, we always have to take a reality check. But it's really hard to figure out, unless you have the full context of where technology is going, if something is simply reality or if it is maybe just a step in product direction, or if it's not going to really come to fruition at all. But trying to see the difference between public art or simple graffiti simply takes a larger view of the ecosystem. One way I've seen this really answered is looking for the points at which technology that facilitates interpersonal communication over mobile devices shifts to other realms where it can provide a solution. One example of this would be in libraries that are using Apple iPads for FaceTime. I found this example in the San Diego Public Library, their brand new library that decided to put these stands with iPads set up preloaded with access to FaceTime on every floor. So in case that person, a patron on that floor, couldn't find a staff or a library worker to provide information at that point, they could use the technology that they were already familiar with, Apple FaceTime, to be able to get an answer from wherever they are. Now, usually I get upset when you see an app, an iPad or a mobile device that is locked down, but this really had location-specific value. It was a perfectly interesting way to do it because it allowed people to use the technology they're already doing instead of having to use some chat feature, etc. Now, of course, the next major areas are going to be an expansion of the smart screens we're interacting with to more and more points within our life, having data aspects, and being able to play a role within the interaction of that data. One interesting way that I see a lot of growth for libraries is the Internet of Things. The spread of everyday objects being smart objects, producing data on their own or interacting with local data. This, of course, started to take off in the last year or so with home appliances that were now data connected, washing machines that could tell you when they're done, thermostats that would automatically adjust, etc. But that was really just the beginning. We're going to see more and more points, not just in the house and the enterprise, but in all aspects of our life that are producing information being shared with each other and being shared with us that we can then either interact with that information or use that information to have it itself make smart decisions. Really interesting implications for libraries here. As more data is produced, there's more data that has to be managed and experts to do that. But there might even be aspects for librarians to work in this where traditional physical objects of use to libraries like print books, etc., themselves can be producing data that someone has to have the expertise to engage with. And then there's the more popular conversation of wearable technology, which has really hit the mainstream conversation with Google Glass. Google's heads-up display, which simply ports your smartphone to screen to a new point on your face where you can have just a look up to be able to engage incoming messages. The reason this is important is because it takes the phone out from between you and the experience. It allows everything to be in line of sight so that, in a way, technology has been removed from being a barrier between you and the real-world experience. And if that comes to fruition, then we're going to see an interesting, different way of engaging information that is going to relax the tensions caused by technology engagement that smartphones have caused over the last couple of years. Whereas we had to adapt to the interpersonal aspects of people looking at their phone instead of looking each other in the eye, where technology changed and forced us to re-examine what was appropriate. Now technology is catching back up with our own expectations instead of us having to. So that may ease the tension to have more and more people engage with smart devices. It also has implications for libraries as more and more points become information accessible because Google Glass is open to developers. So lots of different product developers are going to be able to produce a way for information consumers to be able to engage content across the world. The other way this is really growing is smartwatches. We have the Pebble smartwatch, which was hugely successful as a Kickstarter campaign, really take off as a major product this year. Simply allows you to be able to read incoming messages, not on your smartphone, but on your wristwatch. So again, you don't have to take your smartphone out of your pocket if you're doing something else. You don't have to interrupt an activity. And they're going to be doing a lot more, and some of them already are. So it'll be really interesting to watch if Apple really does release its own smartwatch this year and what implications that has for where people are going to be engaging with information. Now, my favorite example that we've seen really take off, so not just a possibility, is the idea of smart connected cars. Almost every major car producer is already putting smart cars out on the market, where they can have access to information or themselves be platforms for information in the form of car-specific applications or as a hub for mobile applications. So they're becoming, most importantly, displays and platforms for outside entertainment or interactive content, or also as interactive agents, not just consuming and providing a platform for signals, but projecting signals, allowing them to interact with the environment around them. This has implications for safe driving, as cars will let other pieces of connected technology around them know that they're coming or in the way. But it also means they can interact with places around them, for instance, letting the library know that they're passing by and the library can share relevant information back to the car. And so in one way, this fits with the larger theme we were talking about earlier of ambient location interaction, but it also means that we're going to have more points of our lives that we have access to larger amounts of data or simply to networked information. Again, the internet is expanding. But technology isn't always coherent or displayed in the correct way. And so the librarian, the information professional, will always have a role in being able to filter that out. Of course, we saw the interesting discussion within the last couple months from a panel with the FAA about being able to allow devices in more parts of flight. And they ruled that non-connected devices will actually be safe on most parts of most flights. But what's really interesting about this aren't the details of what device is and when. It's that it reflects the tension for when we have a relevant policy that was time sensitive to when planes were actually in danger from network technology. And now we have huge cultural expectations and tensions when we don't have access to those devices. And so we've really seen that these changes take time, and that time tension, that lack of speed for the policy change to connect with our expectations in a technological world can actually be perfectly valid, and it's something that we librarians should be able to identify with and be patient with. So it's an example of us having to have patience for adapting our rules to work now with validity in new cultural experiences. I found this sticker in the Bay Area recently, and I liked it not only, of course, its enthusiasm for the importance of reading, but that the message, the demand, and the expectation for reading continues to go up, and there's an excitement level to it where people want to use it for guerrilla art. And it reminds me, again, about energy around core strengths, moonshots, and the interesting things going around in content news. Now, there's lots changing in content technology, but what I really think is interesting recently are the changes in traditional, or traditional within the context of the last few years, content technology that are reflecting the larger cultural expectations. Goodreads, which has been big for a while, is starting to make a bigger emphasis on its social aspects in lieu of its service in the idea of discovery. So whereas it used to be about being able to have a social connection to discover new books to read, now it's more about engaging your social sphere over reading. There's a really interesting science development was in the last month about a really ancient clay, not tablet, but a ball actually, for which information was stored and shared. And this makes me reflect, of course, on what's going on in sharing of content and communication diffusely now. One of my favorite examples, of course, would be that we have this ongoing need for print, but attention about the space it takes up. And, of course, in Epidemia, that means that we're always trying to figure out what's the idea for having locally relevant information available to tip of our fingers, as well as being able to be called quickly, but balancing that. The real question here is how we're balancing the transition to different expectations within the environment of content with the role of the physical library. And focusing on that tension, focusing on the need to be hyper-relevant in differing streams can really lead us to maintaining inappropriately narrow streams for our future vision. What I'm more interested in looking at are one of the new streams for content and for a librarian role. I started reading more and more comic books online. I'm not sure if I should admit, but it's true, and I have a subscription to a digital subscription service that allows me to consume as much of this traditionally print material as I would like for a monthly fee in the model of Netflix. Now, this example, besides being an unfortunate panel from it, showed me that there's really a need for librarians within this role. If I get to an issue that hasn't been properly metadated or is not accessible when it should be, there's no one for me to call upon because I simply bought the subscription through the content producer itself. There's no librarian advocating for me. And there needs to be a librarian in every new streaming role. Of course, Amazon sometimes plays catch up and sometimes guides the field and change. In this aspect, with Amazon Kindle Matchbook, it allows you to get access to an electronic copy if you already have access to the print edition, which makes perfect sense for me, although I wish this was even further expanded. I like to read my content in cross formats, sometimes in print, sometimes on my mobile device, sometimes with audio. And I really always hope for the ability to sync my progress between those and my notes, etc. And this is one nice step towards this. Amazon Kindle also partnered with audible.com so that your progress in your audiobook can be picked up exactly where you left off when you switch to your electronic book, etc. And it's always interesting to watch the largest social players when we're looking for examples of what's happening next in content. Now, as Twitter tries to go public with its IPO soon, it's experimenting with more ways of keeping people connected and keeping people focused on Twitter as that sharing point. And one way they're doing this is with small projects like Event Parent, which simply allow you to get updates via direct messaging. Now, this is an interesting change because, of course, Twitter has always been really important in sharing with micro-messaging of content. But now they see that there's an overwhelming flood of Twitter resources, but there's not necessarily a direct flood within the idea of having to have specific notifications that DMs are still valuing. And so being able to allow people to send, or resources to send, not just tweets to you, but direct messages to you, allows us to then go to where the hype still is and where there's still attention focus. And of course, Twitter's doing a lot more interesting things with content. With partnerships with major content producers, they're allowing you not just to share content via tweets, but to directly consume that content in tweets, like with sports shows that allow you to watch clips from games directly within a tweet. So it's combining the idea of streaming content, of having social access to that content, and changing the places that are serving as platforms for content consumption. Now, there's also some really interesting aspects that have been fun to watch this year, as Twitter officially partners with Nielsen, and it's being proved that tweet chatter is not only impacting, but is in line with other rating metrics. And of course, there's downsides and unpredictability with when that major sci-fi movie Sharknado was big. It was huge on Twitter as a chatter piece, as in there were much more people talking about it than there were actually people consuming it. But that led it to actually have not just a television release, but a release in theaters. So the chatter gave it more opportunities, even though traditional ratings wouldn't have. What I find even more interesting, though, is how Facebook has elected to send TV networks directly weekly updates about data for how their shows are being talked about on Facebook. So this is Facebook wanting to make sure that the TV producers are aware that not just Twitter, but Facebook has a huge value in the expansion of the conversation around content points, that those analytics, those metrics are really important to a lot of different players. And we're seeing in this aspect some really interesting tipping points where social is not just an addendum, or it's not just an add-on to content, but it's becoming more and more a way for traditional values of content to expand. We've also, in another tipping point, seen the actualization of these subscription models for ebooks. 24 Symbols has been around for several years now. Of course, the Oyster app was released a few months ago. The idea, what's really important here aren't the specific products, but the idea that you're gaining subscription level access to unlimited content consumption based on the same model that really took not only Netflix but Spotify to successful heights. The idea of the freemium model. You get a little bit for free, but to get the full experience, whether it's content or features, you have to pay a base level. So it's combining these megatrends across social, mobile, and content of subscription and streaming. That's really what's important here. And then more recently, you probably heard about the Script product, which has always had social content, but recently added the ability to engage electronic books. And that's really been interesting because of the amount of attention it's gotten, because of the level and size of the player entering the field. So now officially, it's not just a technology trend. This is a major direction for content. And of course, that's an opportunity for libraries to play a role, because our brand is continuing to be about books just as much as it is about technology. Not just that we have books, but that we're ready for those books to play a role in the future, that we're book strong and future ready. And of course, that as we continue to have a role in content, we're not getting defined into inappropriately small boxes and being able to be defined out of existence by that role with content. We don't want to be hurt by being indistinguishable from other book services or being able to have to compete with them, which on some levels we can't and won't be able to, and on some levels it's not necessarily appropriate. Now, of course, there's lots of other traditional ways that have been interesting to watch, like the expansion of the video on demand idea as something that used to just be a side feature and then was now a competition against piracy and is now being a central competition against upstarts. CBS now allows you to view on-demand content the next day, which is a really interesting reversal because they see that the consumption of content continues to be more and more about people's expectations for being on their time. And so it's a really interesting way that broadcast television is pivoting to stay relevant in the face of major competition from technological changes. Of course, iTunes Radio was not the first of its kind, but it's really interesting because iTunes is being one of the largest in the, not just technology player, but player within the digital media landscape. So we always have to watch what Apple's doing. And then, of course, there's other technologies which are gaining attention. The confluence of drone unmanned vehicles with delivery and with content has been interesting. Here's one specific example of that. And what I like here is that there's a huge tension around drones because of the political and public perception, that context, but also with technological innovation being limited in some regions but not others. This specific example comes from Australia because the regulation on drone development within America is much too tight. Now, the company chose to deliver textbooks, of all things, because, as the founder said, if you can deliver a textbook, other things will be much more valuable. So they're not really necessarily seeing the end game as content, but content as a test case for larger. Just as libraries are a test case for larger implications. You can see how a community is going to treat its businesses, whether they're small or large, startups or major corporations in changing times, based on how they treat its library. You see the same idea of the library as canary in the gold mine by looking at the larger landscape. Simply check out what the support for critical community infrastructure is as we look to changing landscapes. Another major content technology trend, of course, has been the second screen. There's been lots of interesting changes in that recently. Beyond the traditional opportunities, some of the most recent things that I've been appreciating would be examples like when Disney released The Little Mermaid Second Screen Live, where they brought The Little Mermaid back to major theaters, but encouraged people to download an application and bring their iPads that they could engage in the movie theater. And lots of people did this. They did this for the opportunity of reconnecting with an old story, but also to be able to do what they would do at home, where they're always engaging the content on a higher level beyond what they're simply watching on the screen. And then, in an interesting twist where, again, nothing is totally new, but the second screen in the bottom example here is not actually a screen, but it's about audio content. So you're engaging the television content as your first screen, and then on your smartphone through audible.com, you're able to actually access original content that is in a whole different format. So Audible and Amazon had partnerships about progress thinking, and now Audible is having larger partnerships to be able to encourage further engagement with content by keeping you part of the story. And so focusing so much on content technology, because that's, of course, a core strength of ours. Also, not being able to be part of that conversation could potentially be a core weakness of ours. But another core area for us, of course, is search. And besides the screenshot, which shows a little bit of search humor, I guess, in search error, we have to reflect upon the major changes in Google search this month. The Google search algorithm has, again, been updated, but it's been called the biggest update in its history, and that there are going to be lots of different industries that are going to be majorly shaken by this. And so as we've had some time to look at this, it's important to think about how these changes to the Google search algorithm are affecting discovery, are affecting advanced search, are impacting scholarly engagement, and are affecting the way that people are going to expect to discover information in more venues. But social is just as important of a role across the information landscape as mobile is and as the cloud is. In fact, the reason social is so important is because it touches upon a core need of humans. And that need is giving us an opportunity to continue to play a role in more aspects of information. I helped create this infographic about using social technology in library settings recently with Library Connect. And what we focused on is that within the social world, there's an ongoing need for curators, for creators, and for consumers to work together in lots of different ways. And that's, of course, that tension, that access point the library is going to have a lot of value in. And the way that social is playing a role in more and more aspects of our lives has been interesting to watch. Twitter, which is nothing new, is having a larger role in how we are not only discovering information, but interacting over it. I like this story, how a recent Nobel Prize winner slept through the call that she had won the prize, but was alerted because they tweeted about it. And I can understand that. I know I'm not going to answer a call at 4 in the morning, but the first thing I'll do won't be check my messages or my text messages or my phone messages, but I will look at what's happening on Twitter. And the landscape is changing in very traditional ways too. We see that the global penetration of network technology is continuing to expand. Really interesting ways show that, of course, where it's happening the most is shifting is something to watch. We see that China, India, Japan all have more internet users than Europe and North America combined. And so when we're looking at the future, we have to consider these major impacts. But it's really interesting to see that this is not universal, but we see a much higher level of penetration from mobile subscriptions than just traditional internet. And of course, you know, Twitter is a stable and long-term part of the community when pop culture is talking about it, when musicians are bragging about it in their songs, etc. And this example of rappers talking about being verified is a perfect example. And the impact that people are able to have over Twitter is really interesting to watch. There's this example of the misreading or maybe the mistiming of a tweet having major impact, but there's also been some others in the market. A couple months ago, a famous investor tweeted that he was going to be investing in Apple, and because of his Twitter reach, the stock price of Apple immediately jumped. When people saw that he was doing this, it must be of value. So the conversation can still continue to have massive impact via social. And I still think that one of the biggest areas for what's going to be changing now is going to be in the micro-video production that people are able to do on their own level. It's going to continue to be smartphone-based. Vine is a huge player in this, but Instagram videos, even there, of course. It's great for sharing blurs, but the really important thing here is that it's shifting who are producers of content and how that is continuing to have a mobile focus. And in all of this, it's important to remember not only that there's massive shifts in technology, but that it's in specific directions, and that technology changes are having major impacts in traditional industries, and thus are having an impact on the way that enterprises, including libraries, are engaging with information technology. Now, returning to a focus on reading, it's really interesting to read that there was an article in Science about how the reading of literary fiction specifically has been shown to lead to better performance on points of interpersonal interaction. Reading is effectively a social activity because you're immersed in an imaginary social environment. And so even in this tangential way, libraries really have an interesting point in the development of emotional and personal intelligence. So it's key that not only librarians are seen to have that, but are seen to be able to be major players within that. And so thinking about those traditional intelligence and a shift towards social really being important, and of course traditional values of libraries do have a role in this. And then as the further expansion of technology has wider and wider implications for society, it's interesting to watch that a lot of society, including libraries, are continuing to focus more and more on the cultural impacts of that, not just opportunities. I think that was really the lesson from IFLA's trend report. They didn't focus much on new technologies or their impact. They focused on the societal impacts, the concerns with data protection, with privacy, as well as the new arenas for engaged learning and interactive content. Now, of course, there's also a new book out that has been called Potentially the Jungle of Our Technological Time. And so just as we see major changes within these very large-scale industries, a lot of people are seeing that the library has a role in being able to evaluate the impacts of those. I think more importantly, we should be focusing on evaluating the opportunities while keeping a clear head about the challenges. Now, we talked about a return of other major platforms to the center stage, and the best example of that, I think, is the re-importance that's being focused on the television screen. Google Chromecast all of a sudden makes mobile content consumers able to use the living room television again without having to shift their own behavior. So it's returning the television to the content consumption environment. Interesting for libraries, of course, because this means we have a new arena within our client's household to consume content, but also it means that there's a shift in what information projection will be like and how easy, as well as for screen sharing. But this means that there's going to be a new battle for the living room, and not just as a place for people to consume on the iPad. And I thought it was really interesting that in a recent study, Americans have been shown to lack at a high level not only the technological skills that are needed in the modern workplace, but the the problem solving, and the technology familiarity skills. So these are important because they directly address the evaluation of information, the communication with technology, etc. These are all areas that librarians have had a big role in trying to facilitate, and we continue to. And this unfortunate lack within the U.S. means that there's a large-scale opportunity for libraries to make sure that there's a connection between that gap. When we do look at messaging technology, what I think has been one of the most interesting stories is who's using Snapchat and where its growth is. Snapchat, which you don't need to hear all the details about, I'm sure you're familiar with, has grown just as much in Wall Street traders as it has in high schoolers, because those people are familiar with the need for being able to maintain their privacy. So being able to choose messaging applications based on that. Of course, pretty wide-ranging impacts for libraries, as mentioned here, as we see that there are new cultural norms that are impacting cultural and communication aspects. Okay, so I want to jump ahead a little bit and talk about how not only subscription everything is a major theme and trend, as well as automatic uploads in the past, but the message is still what's really key. When I took this picture, I was astounded at how everything was no. And of course, the librarians have been talking about this for a long time, that attitudinal aspects of your engagement with the library is important, but really so are cultural considerations for what we're choosing to do. If no is our first reaction to the opportunities produced by new technology, then we are always going to continue to be really put offish. And it's interesting to see that instead of focusing really on trying to get to change and getting to the value of that, we should be focusing, as this quote says, that change itself will lead to insight far more often than the reverse. And so being able to address the change, to try it out, and then seeing what opportunities come can be a key way of looking forward. All right, I'm going to jump a little bit ahead and talk about how returning values continues to expand well beyond technology. I thought this was interesting how the library had a quiet room, not for patrons, but for staff, because they no longer felt like on their breaks they could go to the rest of the library for quiet space, because the library was abuzz with productivity, but they still valued their quiet space. And the real value of the conversation, I think, is being able to come together to look for these moonshot opportunities. I want to hear what you're doing to push the industry forward, and I want to see how I can help you do that. I want to see what we're all doing together to strive forwards and what we're striving towards, and how we each can use the benefit of community to get there. And remind ourselves that there's absolute joy and inspiration points for libraries by our traditional values. We have those, we need to keep those, but the future, the growth, is going to be based on our creativity around technological change. And earlier I showed you those Post-it notes of children who were inspired by the space shuttle, and some of them realized that it was just a good and fun opportunity to have a little bit of interpersonal communication. So they weren't all talking about what was making them inspired, but just what was making them happy. And I like here in the central post that it was an and that's important. All right, so the lesson, the point to move forward is that now's the point to go. It's always the start clock, and it's always the opportunity to grow and expand. So go forth and do it. Keep us in the loop. Let us know what your future challenges are, and let's continue to stay in touch about those growth opportunities. I'm again going to share the link to these slides in the chat window. Let's keep in touch, and we have a couple minutes for questions. So what do you got for me?
Joe, Mr. Murphy, we've lost your audio.
Okay, do you have my audio back?
Yes. We have a couple of questions in the chat box. One question is from Ruth Lynn at the very bottom, and she asks, about the library keeping up with archiving information?
Yeah, that's an interesting area because the points that need to be archived continue to expand. So there's, of course, lots of new technology within traditional archiving, but what's also really interesting is what's being archived. The social conversations, the social points around research and academia are being archived, and that means more than just blogs, but tweets and Facebook, etc. But it'll really be interesting to see how that is impacted in areas like Snapchat, where it's not just a Facebook conversation you can download, but there's something that has an impermanence attached to it. So when something automatically doesn't last, it's going to be up to researchers and users, et cetera, to decide what needs to be part of that conversation we archive ongoing. That's going to be an interesting challenge for us for sure.
Mr. Murphy, did the changing platforms for archiving the information have a big impact?
To the changing platforms, of course, but that's not really where large-scale impact is going to come from. It's going to come from on the higher levels. It depends on what's really interesting for me, and if you want to talk about archiving, is going to be the collaborative and communicative aspects of this. There's, of course, not only more things that need to be archived, but there's more places at which we can work together, and there's larger bodies that we can play a part in. So it'll be fun to watch how we can have new opportunities working together, so instead of us all having our own individual areas, we have something we can work on.
I have a very lengthy question, and I'll try and pare it down, which is in terms of steering the students towards conceptualizing the technology in the library as facilitating their learning rather than just computers. Do you think that really takes the administration and all the other stakeholders to get involved in that so that it can be promoted campus-wide and advertised, etc.?
Yeah, it's hard for me to pare down what the main point of this question is, but the inclusion of as wide stakeholders as possible is really always critical. That's a really good point. The ability to sell and advocate for the role of the library in the expansion of new arenas and the ability to meet wider skills and needs is really important. And as many people that can be on board as possible is more important than going out and doing it in a guerrilla fashion, but being able to demonstrate to the wide audience the impact, the value is the best point for that beginning of conversation. All right, I see that it's past 3, so we probably have to wrap up. Let's keep in touch. If you have further questions, let me know. Thanks so much for your great questions and for this conversation. Have a great weekend.